Hi everyone, welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library, and today we are going to be talking about ending your story, writing the conclusion and wrapping everything up. All right, so in this video we're going to be talking about wrapping up your plot lines, so bringing your actual story to its conclusion, delivering on promises made, all right, the things that you've talked about in your story, you have to fulfill what you've been talking about. You have to have some sense of closure to the things that you've been talking about. The downtime between the end of your actual story and the end of your actual writing, right? Because when you wrap up your plot lines, usually you'll have a little bit extra just to kind of set things up or just to kind of wrap up the loose ends. All right, hinting at the future. This can mean like preparing for a possible sequel story, but it doesn't have to. All right, there's a lot more to hinting at the future than just sequels, and we'll talk about that. And your closing sentences, which in a lot of ways can be just as important as your opening sentence. All right, it's a lot to get into. Let's get started. So first, let's talk about wrapping up your plot lines, and this is the conclusion of your story. This is the climax of your story. All right. We talked in a previous video a little bit about how the action of your story will rise and fall. Where you have moments of a lot of activity and then like a little downtime, and then moments of more activity and then downtime. And this all builds and builds until you get to the actual climax of your story. It's what you've been building towards throughout your entire story. Right? It's where the good guy confronts the bad guy for the last time. It's where that big event that had been planned is happening finally. It's where the mystery is fully revealed and the perpetrator is caught. Things like that. The climax of your actual story. Okay? And it's the payoff to what you've been building up. All right? So throughout your entire story, you've been building up towards this climax. All right? You've been laying the foreshadowing. You've been putting down all the hints. You've been talking about what's going to happen at this climax in one way or another throughout your story. All right, and this is where it all kind of comes to a head. So it's really important that you are sure to wrap up everything that you need to wrap up. All right, whatever happens at the climax of your story, you have to make sure that it makes sense to the reader. Okay. Your climax doesn't always have to be a happy ending, but it should be a satisfying ending. All right. So what I mean by that is if you're going to have like a mystery story and there's a specific bad guy, but the bad guy gets away, he's not caught, then there has to be some kind of payoff to give the reader that sense of satisfaction. That even though the bad guy got away, something else happened or something has been revealed. Something that will give the reader that satisfaction of a proper conclusion. Okay? So be sure to resolve all the plot lines in your story, even minor ones. Okay? Because throughout your entire story, you will have your main story, but you'll also have little side stories that are going on throughout the story that involve different characters. So make sure you wrap those up too. If you just leave it dangling, if you just have no resolution to a plot line, it leaves the reader feeling unsatisfied because you don't know. Maybe they were very invested in that minor plot line and there's no payoff for it at all. Then the reader's going to be disappointed. Okay. Not everything has to be neat and tidy, but it should at least be addressed. So you can have plot lines that don't have firm resolutions where maybe like whatever the issue is with this plot line would most likely continue in the future beyond the point that your story itself ends. That's fine. Not everything has to be, wrapped up in a neat bow and handed to the reader, but you have to at least address the plot line. You have to say something that will give the idea that even though it's not kind of settled now, there is a possibility or at least a probability that it will be resolved in the future. Okay? So you have to at least address it. Otherwise, the reader's just going to think that you just forgot about it or just don't care, right? Now, there are such things as double climaxes and last-minute twists. This is where you build up to a climax of your story, but then you kind of undercut it at the last second to surprise your reader, where the thing that you thought they had been building towards turns out to not be the main event, and then you have a secondary, a bigger climax afterwards. You can do this, right? But be careful. Okay, because if you have a reader's expectations at a certain point at the end of your story, and then you completely turn things around on them, they might feel cheated. They might feel disappointed that they're not getting to see the thing that they had, been expecting to see. A good twist, and we've talked about twists in the past, a good twist can help kind of fix this. It can help get the reader more interested in your new climax as opposed to your old one. But it's a tricky thing, so be careful if you plan on doing this. All right? You can have your one climax and then it turns out there's another one after that. But be careful with it. Okay? That's all I'm saying. Just be careful with it. You can do it, but be careful. Now let's talk about delivering on promises made. Now, what do I mean by promise? In this sense, I'm not talking about a situation where you, the author, would be speaking directly to a reader and say, I promise I will do this or that. That's not what I'm talking about. All right, a promise in this case is something that you have set up. All right, if you set something up in your story, you need to follow through with that thing. That can be like a plot element. It could be like a possibility of a twist. It could be a red herring. It could be something that is somewhat eye-catching, something that's somewhat unusual, that has to do with your story, that has to be addressed by the end. All right? Now that might sound a little confusing. Let me give you an example. Maybe that will help. So, as an example, if your story hints at something, and here's the example, your mystery story hints at the possibility of a supernatural element, then you have to address that thing. Okay? In our example, the supernatural element of a mystery is brought up either by a character or even just through the implications of the situation, right? If you have a mystery where part of that mystery doesn't seem like it could be resolved or could be solved through natural means or could not have been done naturally, and a character brings up the possibility of there being a supernatural element. Unless that is clearly done as a joke, then you have now introduced this element to your story. You have made a promise that this will be addressed later on. Okay, you have set it up in such a way that it has to be talked about at some point. Now that doesn't mean that it has to be true. Okay, you don't have to reveal all your hints and all your elements to be exactly as stated, but you do have to address them. You do have to talk about them. If you can, you should resolve them, but they have to be at least be addressed beyond just, oh yeah, that was a thing. All right. So in our example, mystery story hints at the possibility of a supernatural element. If at no point throughout the rest of the story you either confirm that there's a supernatural element or show how there is not a supernatural element, then you have not delivered on that promise. Okay? You have set something up and not done anything with it. All right? And that feels like it's just a waste. It's a waste of the reader's time. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of space. Why bring something up if it's never going to be addressed again? When you write something, you really need to focus on the important aspects of it. Okay? Now, you could set something up to be a red herring, which, if you remember, is something that the reader might think might be a possibility as like an answer to a mystery, but it isn't. Okay? If you set something like that up, that's fine, but you have to show that it's not the solution. Okay? You have to confirm that it's not what actually happened. Okay? So in our example, if you do not have a supernatural element to your mystery, but somebody has brought it up at some point, then at some point you have to show how it is not a supernatural element. Okay? And it's really important because your reader is expecting that. All right? If you set something up for your readers, they will feel betrayed if that thing is not addressed by the end of your story. Okay? Now again, it doesn't necessarily have to be resolved completely, but it should at least be talked about. Okay? You can leave it kind of ambiguous. Like in our example, is there a supernatural element? Oh, maybe. But do something with that. Okay? Don't just leave it just completely up in the air and like it's almost like everyone forgot about it. Because that's not fulfilling. That's not satisfying to the reader. Okay? Now this feels kind of personal to me because I have seen this go bad. All right? There has been a story that I've read in the past where an issue, it was a mystery story, an issue was set up towards the beginning that I thought was very interesting. And it was one of those possibilities. And it's possible that it was just a red herring, but it was done in such a way that it really felt like it was an important aspect of the story. And it just was never really talked about properly. It was never resolved. Like, it would be hinted at several times, but it was never really resolved. And it was barely even addressed by the end. Like, it was mentioned, but not in a way that felt satisfying, not in a way that really addressed the issue. All right. And so that element was just kind of left floating in the air. And I was very upset about it. It spoiled that entire book for me. And that one element of the story, even though it wasn't the primary element, was still important enough, significant enough, that it needed to be addressed properly. And if it had been something where maybe it was not properly addressed and then resolved in a later story or somewhere else, that would have been fine, but it wasn't. It was just left completely ambiguous. And I understand that sometimes authors want that. Authors want there to be an ambiguity to certain elements of their story. And that's fine to a certain extent, but it really has to be on a case-by-case basis. Because sometimes that will work, but a lot of times it won't. And it'll just make your reader feel, well, betrayed. It'd be like the reader feels like you, as the author, don't know the answer. And because of that, they feel like you just kind of cheated them. Okay? Now, if you're going to set something up for the future, like if you have a sequel in mind where you're going to resolve an issue, then we're going to talk about this more later, but if you're going to do that, you need to set something up for it. Okay? We'll talk about that when we talk about hinting at the future. But if you have a major element to your story that is talked about and brought up, then you have to fulfill that promise. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So now let's talk about downtime. This is what I refer to as the time between the climax of your story and the actual end of the writing, all right? The actual end of your book, the last sentence, all that, all right? This is kind of the cooling off period, all right? This is where the climax has reached its absolute highest peak, and then you kind of have that slow kind of wind down at the end. Kind of like you're on a roller coaster, you have that little bit at the very end that kind of helps you calm down before you get off. It's the same concept. And you use this time to help the reader kind of adjust to what's going on after the climax. You also use it to tie off loose ends. And you can also use it to address anything that's not resolved and to set up the future of your characters. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but it's very important that you set up your characters for life beyond your story, okay? You don't want to make this section too long, okay? Because you don't want to bore your reader after most of the action is over. Remember, the entire focus of the book is getting to that climax, all right? So you should have something after the climax, but if you make it too long, then the reader is going to start to feel bored and not have any idea where it's going. This happened with a book for me a while ago that I read where the actual climax of the story, which was actually the climax of a whole trilogy, happened within the first 10 chapters of a 40-chapter book. And the rest of the book just felt so slow as a result because the climax that had been built up over the beginning of that book and honestly, but throughout the entire trilogy up to that point, had ended so quickly that it left way too much downtime afterwards. And that had a horrible effect on the book for me as a reader. Some people have different tastes when it comes to length of downtime and where and how a climax happens, but I have always felt that if you keep the downtime short, it is a lot better than having it be very long. You want to set things up, kind of have the aftermath, but that's it. Then you're done. Okay? You want to keep your reader satisfied with the ending without making them bored by rambling on. Okay? So now let's talk about that. Let's talk about hinting at the future. What would happen after your story officially ends? All right. One is you can set up a sequel story if you want. If you have an idea for more than one story with the same characters in the same world, you can set up like the groundwork for your next sequel, right? And this is something we talked about previously with the unresolved plot lines, because if you have all plot lines, as long as they're addressed, they don't necessarily have to be resolved. In fact, having unresolved plot lines is a good way to hint at a future story or at future development for those characters. So it's okay, like I said before, not to resolve every single plot line, but you should at least address it in some way, right? So during this downtime we just talked about, you can use that to kind of set up the plot lines, set up a sequel story if you want, whatever it is, just set up for your characters for the future. Okay? Because remember, in your reader's mind, while the story you are telling ends, the characters and the setting can continue on. Right? This is why fan fiction is a thing, because people want to know what happens to characters that they like, that they enjoy, past the point of the story or whatever it is that they know them from. Okay, so in your reader's mind, the characters and the world that you are presenting to them should be able to continue, right? It should make sense that your characters can do something else. Like the next day, they're still going to get up and live their life. The events of your story have happened. Now what? Right? And it's not necessarily your job to tell them that, but you should at least set up a way for the reader to have an idea of what can happen. All right. So you don't have to be specific, but you can give hints as to how things will go. All right. This kind of leads to one of the most cliche lines in literature, which is, of course, the happily ever after. And they all lived happily ever after. That leaves it very vague, but on a positive note. It's the same concept there, that they continue to live beyond the point of the story. Your characters continue beyond the story, and with happily ever after, it's they lived happily. Doesn't mean they never had any issues again, just means that for the rest of their life was generally happy. That's fine, if that's how you want to do it. But the idea is you want to set it up in such a way that your characters' lives will continue beyond the scope of your story, because your reader should be able to know that. All right? Your reader should know, well, their life continues beyond the point of the story. And it's fun for the reader to be able to imagine what happens. Leaving some things up to interpretation is really helpful because it gets the reader more invested. And it makes them think more about what could happen. All right? So be sure to set up the future of your characters, the future of your world. Even if it's not for a sequel, you should still have a setup of some kind just to show that those characters in that world will continue on, even if you're not telling the story of the rest of their lives. Okay? So now let's talk about closing sentences. This is it, the last line of your story. This is what you're going to leave your reader with at the very end. All right? Like with opening sentences, your closing sentences are very important. All right? They are the last thing your reader will read of your story. All right? It's like the last bite of a meal. It's what you want your reader to take last from you. All right? It's that last kind of taste, that last sense of what your story is all about. All right? And it's really important because this is what you're going to leave your reader with at the end. All right? A good ending isn't just about what happens, but it's also how you tell that story. All right? So the last line of your story is actually very important. Probably not as important as the opening sentence, but it is still important. All right? You want to maintain the tone that you're going for throughout your story. All right? If you suddenly shift tone with the last sentence, it's going to throw your reader off and it's going to kind of sour the experience. All right? So you want your last sentence to kind of give a feeling for what the entire story was about. Think about how you want your reader to feel. All right? Do you want them to feel worried? Do you want them to feel satisfied? Do you want them to feel excited? Do you want them to feel, tired? All of those are legitimate options for the end of a story. So think about how you want your reader to feel when they finish your book, because your last sentence is your last chance to get them to that feeling, to convey that emotion to your reader. Okay, it's your last chance. So make sure you use it properly, right? In a way, your closing sentence should wrap up the entirety of your story. You don't have to sum it up. This isn't an essay that we're talking about. We're talking about a story. All right. You don't have a last sentence that is a summation of your entire story up to that point, but it does wrap it up. All right. It's the end. It's the final thing. All right. So make sure that you put some thought into what your last words in your story are going to be, because that's the last thing that your reader will see of your story, and that will stay with them. All right. A good closing sentence should wrap up your story. It should leave the reader feeling satisfied in one way or another, and it should leave the reader with the emotion that you've been trying to get across. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So use this time, use this position, the end of your story, to kind of bring it all home. Bring your story home at the very end, right? You have your climax, you have your cool down period, wrap things up, you prepare for the future, and you leave on one last note. And that'll be it. And then you're done. You finished your story. And now it's time to go back and edit it again and again and again, and then proofread it again and again. And that is fine, because that's part of the process. And it's almost impossible to say you are actually done with a story. But at some point, you have to allow yourself that. You have to say, you have to feel the confidence to say, I'm done, right? So the closing sentence might not be the last thing you write of your story, but it is the last thing your reader will read of the story. And that's why it's important, okay? So have fun with this, enjoy the process, and however you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me.